So hopefully we've got Ruslan with us. So thank you, Ruslan, for continuing the journey with us today. We're forging ahead with technology so we can be virtually together in spirit, even if we're not in body. So thank you very much, everybody. We're truly delighted to be in this panel today, enabling central bank cash for use in capital markets. So I've got an esteemed panel here of people that I've known and worked with again over many years. So I'll just let Ruslan, I know you've already introduced yourself, but just very briefly for those who've joined the room, would you mind introducing yourself? And then I'll go on to Daniel and then Italo.
Sure, thank you. My name is Ruslan Konurbayev, and I'm chief expert at the National Payment Corporation of Kazakhstan. We are doing a lot of interesting projects, Open API, Anti-Fraud Center, but my particular role is in our CBDC project called Digital Tenge.
Thank you. Daniel.
Hi, everyone. Accenture. I'm the APAC lead for digital assets and currency, and also global lead for compliance and risk and regulation. Great to be here.
Good afternoon, everyone. And my name is Italo Borssatto. I work at the BIS, the bank for the central banks, in the Innovation Hub here in Hong Kong as an advisor. Mainly in the projects that use the blockchain technology, like mBridge, Auron, Dynamo, these projects from the Hong Kong Center. Yeah.
Very good. And I'm really pleased that we've got the panel we've got, because all of the people in the panel have all been very, very significant contributors to innovation in CBDC over the last few years. So it's really important to hear the perspective, but from different directions, both at the innovation level, at the production level, and at the BIS level in terms of participation in various actual practicing pilots and experiments, which is really important. So if we actually look at where the latest developments are in CBDC adoption, and in particular in wholesale markets, my first question is, should we start with a level set, just for those that in the room that aren't sure about the difference between CBDC and commercial bank money? I'm going to ask Italo just to very quickly set the scene on that difference between M0 and commercial bank money, because it is super important when it comes to use cases.
Yes, and I think it's important for those from Web3 also, because we see a lot of assets like stable coins being used, and it's good to understand why there is a difference between these different types of money. So when we talk about M0, we talk about the money that is exchanged between banks and central banks. It's not the money that individuals have access. Of course, we also use the term legal tender, which is by the law accepted as the money with more liquidity in that country, and you must accept that as a currency for exchanging services and paying for services, for payments. When we use the term M1, we are talking about the money that we usually access in deposits and in the bank. The main difference on that is that when the M0 you have represented in the balance sheet of the central bank, it's a guarantee that you can receive that money, right? It's a bit different from what we see in the banks, because usually they extend this liquidity. This is good also because you can bring more liquidity for the market, right? Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to have all the instruments in the capital market that we have now. Yeah.
Now we know the difference between M0 and commercial bank money. The question, and I'll pose it to Daniel first, is what are the use cases that we're looking at for that define the importance of wholesale CBDC?
Yeah. First of all, I just want to say that I love Hong Kong. I've lost my phone twice. I've got my phone back twice.
What's worrying is the fact that you lost your phone twice, and that's in 2 days.
In 2 days. In 2 days.
Pretty worrying.
Sorry, I just wanted to say that. There's plenty of use cases. So we're working on both wholesale and retail use cases across many different central banks, and then also working with some commercial banks around implementation of that. What we're seeing is that, I mean, this is public knowledge, so I can say it. We've worked with Riksbank, with Sweden, working with Bank of Spain, working with Bundesbank, Bank of Indonesia, SAMA, many other central banks. What we've noticed is that certainly there's been a focus on retail initially from a lot of players, and then there's been a shift over to wholesale, which we're seeing more and more. We've obviously also been working on mBridge with BIS, which is a fantastic project as well. What we've seen over a period of time is that initially there was this push for retail CBDC. We saw this, for example, in Sweden with Riksbank, and then there was almost this shutdown after the election of a more conservative party. Now there is benefits to retail CBDC, of course, because legal tender is obviously a public good, and people are trying to improve efficiency, cost savings, and access. But we're slowly seeing this shift to a wholesale focus. Now, even with digital euro, for example, which has a retail focus, that's not based on DLT. So it's really focused upon payments in general. But what we're seeing from central banks, which is also interesting for me, is that central banks are really arguably, and Italo, I'd love your view on this as well, and Ruslan as well, around that it seems like it's like a competition. And they're competing for the market as fiat currency becomes almost less used in the public arena. And there's a competition between now with stable coins and with digital money, and CBDCs, and central banks need to be relevant. And so we're having conversation with a lot of central banks about being relevant in today's world and in the future world. And we can talk more about that as well. But certainly we're working on both retail and wholesale, Angie, and wholesale is picking up.
And Ruslan, can I just pose the question to you from a wholesale CBDC perspective? What do you see from the National Bank of Kazakhstan's perspective and National Payment Corporation perspective as the most common use case you think you're going to be moving towards in the future?
Yeah, for now we are interested in, and we are conducting a lot of experiments with our payments with government. I mentioned several of our use cases during my keynote presentation. I don't think that will be the only way of doing that, but it seems that for the regulator, it's maybe one of the most interesting topics, simply because there is actually a lot of things can be achieved quite easily with the use of CBDC in this particular role. But in my personal opinion, I think the main goal of wholesale and main price of wholesale actually lies in cross-border integration and actually facilitating cross-border payments, because I firmly believe that cross-border payments with CBDC will actually become the very future of the overall cross-border payments that will finally actually ensure the greater throughput and the overall international trade efficiency.
I agree that's absolutely the way to go, cross-border. So I'm going to pass it over to Italo. From your point of view, what do you see as being the most likely use cases that we're going to see in terms of early adoption in the wholesale CBDC space, and what do you think is driving us towards those use cases? And I know you're living very close to that every day at the moment, so that'd be great to get your perspective.
Yes. And first, a disclaimer here, it's my personal opinion, it's not the BIS one, so absolutely. I'm very focused in projects here in the Hong Kong center, and in the mBridge, for example, for the cross-border, the use of wholesale and cross-border. In this case, it's interesting because when you see the cross-border payments, there are a few primitives that you take in consideration that sometimes we don't pay attention to that. And usually it takes more time, not because the technology is not advanced enough, but because the framework, the legal frameworks and the compliance and regulations from each country, they differ. And of course, all the commercial banks and central banks, they take risk and compliance very seriously. They must, right? And this, at the end, is what causes most of the delays that we see. And one important factor when we talk about wholesale CBDCs, specifically in cases where you have interoperability solved, is that you can have the atomicity of the transactions. And when we talk about atomicity of transactions in two countries with two currencies, the improvements are even better compared to the traditional systems. And I would say that it's something that we cannot see now in the traditional systems, right? So imagine that you have an FX and the settlement in each country happening atomically in seconds, instead of waiting a nostro-vostro account in each country and the end of the day to have that transfer being confirmed, right? Because when we talk about the M0 money, we are talking about the balance sheet of each country being consolidated at the end of the day. In most of the cases, it's not a 24/7 consolidation. And this is what brings the improvements when you think about these solutions. And I'm talking specifically about mBridge here in solutions for multi-CBDC. But of course, even in domestic cases, I would say, so in this case, the use case would be international trades, for example, remittance, all these cases where we see the need for a cross-border payment, e-commerce. And domestically, I think we also have a few other use cases that are interesting. In this case, it's more related to onboarding new institutions, right? Because the M0 money, and this answers a bit of your question, why things are evolving in this space.
Yep.
To the wholesale CBDC and not retail. I think that one of the reasons is that it's easier, right, to deal with changes in the legal frameworks in your country, and you don't change. Imagine, I think we are in a moment that with wholesale CBDCs, some central banks can realize that they can scale. They don't need to deal only with those commercial banks. But changing that, it's a challenge. So domestically, it's a bit more difficult to see all these improvements. You always see when you also consider the tokenization of other assets, like the examples of buying a car and transferring that atomically with the payment, right? But in the cross-border, it's easier to see when you see the settlement atomicity in both countries happening at once. Yeah.
Can I just add to that? Because I think you've referred to the legal framework quite a few times, and I think I've heard quite a few commentators say, "Don't worry, we can introduce CBDC because it's fine. It's in the current definition of what legal tender is. That you don't need any changes." Absolutely not true. Absolutely unequivocally not true. You need changes in regulation. You need changes in the laws before you can introduce CBDC, including whether in fact central banks can even issue CBDC in the first place, or whether they have the power to introduce laws to make that change. And then on top of that, in the retail sphere, you need to change not just the definition of legal tender, but you need to look at broader laws, including corporate laws, including property laws, including all these other laws. So it's super complex, and including with retail, it's super costly. And what we're working on with some of the central banks right now is what is the business case to introduce retail CBDC? What is the business case? And it's not easy to answer. It can take months and months.
I think it varies. The problem is it varies from jurisdiction.
Absolutely.
So much.
Absolutely.
That every single jurisdiction has to analyse it in its own right, and that in itself takes a very, very long time.
Absolutely right.
So, and you've made a very good point as well in the sense that in order to be prepared to launch wholesale or retail CBDC, most jurisdictions are facing, as you say, very significant regulatory and legislative changes, and that in and of itself can take a very long time.
Absolutely, and I think that there's another piece of it, which is there's almost this, I don't want to say a negative connotation, but there's a certain perceptions that exist around CBDC, and we're looking at, for example, the US right now, and what will happen with the current election coming up, and what will happen with CBDC going forward with the most dominant currency in the world, which is the US dollar. And you also have to deal with geopolitics around central bank digital currencies, and then also public perception, especially retail consumers who are looking at certain arguably negative side of central bank digital currency. So these are big issues, and my view, and this is not Accenture's view, but my view is that if, for example, if Trump wins on Tuesday, then I believe that you will not see a US CBDC for sure, and not just for 4 years, but potentially for 12, because it will go for Vance for the next 8 years afterwards. So my view is that this is again my view only, okay, but the most dominant currency in the world will not adopt CBDC in my view for the next 12 if Trump wins on Tuesday. And I told someone I'll say Trump 3 times.
Oh.
On this.
We're not allowed to talk about politics.
No, just
so moving swiftly on. So listen, cross-border, as you say, with that sort of instantaneous finality, and it absolutely, I think everybody recognises from a wholesale CBDC perspective, it's a very, very valid use case, pretty much the world over, right? So, Ruslan, I'm going to ask you a question. Let's talk more domestically about the use of wholesale CBDC from your point of view and in relation to the relationship you have with the financial market infrastructures within Kazakhstan. Where do you see the most likely use case for wholesale CBDC?
Well, basically, there are 2 use case scenarios that I consider and we consider as maybe the most interesting one. One of them is related to the overall use of CBDC for different type of assets, and we are talking about any kind of securities, and of course we're also talking about digital assets because, well, CBDC is to some extent a digital asset, and we can actually mention again our experience with our stock exchange, Kasia, and with Binance, one of the world's largest and I guess the largest crypto exchanges for now. So yeah, that's actually maybe one of the most interesting scenario for now. Another scenario, I would say maybe a little bit more trivial, but I actually see the great potential. We think that CBDC has enormous potential regarding supply chain. Because you have a lot of different contractors or subcontractors, you need to pay exact amount to different people, maybe to do it at one particular moment. There is a lot of things to do. And we can actually see that CBDC, especially tokenized ones, are able to automate this process extremely well. Unfortunately, there's a lot of things that actually lies outside the field of CBDC. It's maybe more about digital public infrastructure that should be built firstly in place to ensure that you actually able to use CBDC. For instance, if you're, I don't know, building your house and you want to pay all of your subcontractors and ensure that everyone receiving his or her particular portion, and all of that done by in some kind of DVP mode. I know DVP is mostly about stock, but we are talking about maybe DVP in terms of delivery of goods for your particular case. But still, we think that these 2 scenarios are the most optimal ones for future exploration. And what is more important here is actually that's not only our opinion. I can actually see a lot of such views all over the globe. And actually, I can mention that as far as I know, there are several experiments with supply chain automation conducted within the Digital Yuan project. So it's actually really nice to see that we are not alone in this particular view of the world.
Indeed, and supply chain is something that we're going to come to a little bit later on when we touch back on mCBDC at the end, hopefully before Daniel runs out the room to catch flight. So let me ask you a question, and let's park legs and regs to one side for the moment, although I know it's, for some people, can be an enormous lift. I think CBUA quoted something like no less than 40 legislative changes that they had to make before they were ready to launch wholesale CBDC. It's an enormous lift. So, and they did it in breakneck speed as well. It was incredible. So, quick question, and I want to ask Ruslan first, because I know you've been through this. You're one of the very few central banks to have actually gone live with CBDC, so you've lived the pain. But aside from the regulatory and legislative challenges, what are the main things that you have to face in order to implement CBDC into a live environment? And I know that varies from central bank to central bank, depending on the infrastructure they're running with today and how much of an existing legacy, if you like, I don't like the use of that word, but I'll use it this once, legacy they have to face to bring forward. But what things were you facing in terms of the lift to get you into production CBDC?
Well, yeah, again, my answer will consist of two parts. One of them, if you're not talking about regulation, one of them is that actually there should be a really solid value proposition. And I guess it's more important for jurisdictions with quite developed digital infrastructure, as in case of Kazakhstan. We actually have quite good banking, maybe I would say really advanced one. But the problem is that if you're trying to make it in a market-oriented approach, you're trying to collaborate with payment service providers, and they have this question, why should we have it? Why we should be interested in that? And there is no any kind of common answer to that, because we actually spent a lot of our effort and time trying to figure out what is the real value of digital tenge for every market participants that exist in Kazakhstani market. And that, believe me, that was quite a task, honestly. It was really difficult to find it. And honestly, I'm still not sure that we have a finalized answer. I think we have it for now, and we are updating our view and our value maybe every year or even every month. But it still is a continuation, and it will take some time in future. The second thing is, I guess, it's more regarding some kind of literacy, I would say, because in my understanding, even people that should have possess some kind of knowledge regarding technologies, they unfortunately don't do that. And that's actually a problem. That's actually why I have included the slide of explanation what is CBDC and what is not CBDC. Because from my experience, people need to have this kind of explanations, and you cannot even imagine how many times I received questions like, "Oh, CBDC, it's like state cryptocurrency, yeah?" And I'm like, "No, that's not it." And I like, well, we need to spend some time on some kind of explanation. That's actually, I mean, there are a lot of like technical problems, maybe some kind of working with legacy systems. Yeah, they are quite important and they are sometimes quite difficult, but honestly, they're not so difficult in comparing to these two problems that we are actually faced with and are still facing at this particular moment.
So Daniel, to you, can I ask the question from a client experience? You're obviously helping a lot of clients with their CBDC journey, both at the innovation level and in their journey into production. What are the main challenges you're seeing elsewhere as central banks prepare for that journey from the experimentation phase, which many of them are actually quite advanced in, as you know,
they are.
through to that production phase?
Absolutely. I mean, there's many issues, many challenges, and we spoke about regulation already, but one of the biggest issues that a lot of central banks are grappling with is around privacy protection, and the idea of transparency. And transparency can be for good, and transparency can also be a negative for a lot of participants in the market. So, and I know we're up at, just from a timing perspective, but I think the privacy element is a core challenge. We're speaking to one other central bank right now who has a whole tower dedicated to privacy protection and security around that as well, and that's a major problem for them. They haven't been able to cure that because of this kind of challenge that they're facing internally, which is that they want to know everything, but they don't want to know everything, and they want mass adoption, but they don't know how to get mass adoption because of this privacy concern. So that for me is one of the big elements around privacy, control, transparency. It's the biggest challenge for central banks.
Yeah, and I think the privacy element is something, I know if Sergey was sitting here now, he'd say, well, that's really interesting. I wonder where we're going to get that from. But anyway, let's not go there because we haven't got enough time. So, quick question, and I know we are really short of time because we did overrun, so I apologise, we have cut it a little bit short today, but Italo, I wanted to touch on interoperability both between central banks and between central banks and other infrastructures, because we have to take into account the fact we're going to be able to need to talk to other existing infrastructures as well as blockchain-based infrastructures. And we also need to take into account the fact that some of the central banks are innovating on blockchain, other central banks are building on traditional centralized technologies. So we have to be able to, I think we touched on it in the previous interoperability panel, we have to be able to go traditional to blockchain, blockchain to blockchain, public to private, private to legacy. We have every connotation that we're taking into consideration. Can I just ask you to touch on mBridge, because I know it's a really important program of work. I know there are many observers, including NBK, in that program, and you've already got 5 central banks active in the mBridge program. What were the challenges and the things that you wanted to accomplish in this stage of mBridge?
Okay. In the case of mBridge, it's not that challenging, to be honest. From the technical perspective, it's not a challenge because we have what we call a unified ledger. We have all the assets in the same ledger. So there's no big need for interoperability between ledgers, let's say. It's more integration through APIs to the system. I see that we will have several unified ledgers, and the BIS have a few reports on that. There is this understanding a few years ago that we would have a unified ledger with all the assets there, right? And payments happening in the same ledger. Now we are talking about the Finternet concept, that you require the interoperability between ledgers, and that's what we see. And going to the point that you brought, I really think that the privacy in all these cases is the most challenging thing. And I think we need at some point to separate and have a different layer for identity and data exchange, and have these ledgers, these shared infrastructures, interoperable infrastructures, dealing exclusively with the settlement of assets. Then I think it will be easier to solve all these issues. Yeah.
Indeed, and I think you're right. It's going to be a world of many ledgers that talk to each other, and the whole Finternet approach is absolutely, in our view, the way to go. It plays very nicely to the innovation that we're doing anyway, for sure. Daniel, in terms of preparing clients from an Accenture perspective, are people believing that we're moving more towards a Finternet type model rather than a single unified ledger that everybody records their assets onto? Is that the way people are now thinking?
Absolutely, I think that's right. That's exactly what we've been hearing from the central banks, exactly what we've been hearing from the commercial bank sector as well. In fact, across the board, that's where we're heading.
Okay, so I think our takeaway, and we're going to have to wrap this up now, is we recognise there are ledgers of ledgers. We recognise that the world is going to be a fairly complicated set of interactions between blockchain and blockchain and centralised infrastructures, and that we need to be able to layer on top of that privacy, compliance, risk and reporting, and all the other things that we are obligated to do within mainstream capital markets. Ruslan, I'm so grateful to you for joining us and for doing your presentation. For those who saw Ruslan's presentation on the amazing work that the National Payments Corporation in Kazakhstan, National Bank of Kazakhstan have done, it is groundbreaking. They are leading the charge on CBDC, and it is truly wonderful what they've done and achieved. Daniel, thank you very much for all the work Accenture have done, and Italo for all the work that BIS are doing in and around CBDC and digital currencies overall. It's really pleasing to see the level of support and interaction we're all having. So thank you very much, everybody. I'm sorry it was all a bit of a rush, but we're very grateful to have you here, and thanks very much.
Thank you.